From Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, this is Writers at Cornell. I'm J. Robert Lennon from the Creative Writing Program of Cornell University's English Department. Every year we bring writers from around the world to Cornell for readings and lectures. I'll be speaking with those writers and presenting the interviews here on this website. Our event this week is something a little different. Composer Joseph Klein has written short musical settings for poems written by our second-year MFA poets, and they'll be performing this work together tomorrow night here on campus. Klein holds a Doctor of Music degree in composition from Indiana University, and he's currently distinguished professor at the University of North Texas College of Music, where he has served as chair of composition studies since 1999. Klein's catalog ranges from solo pieces to works for large ensemble, including instrumental, vocal, and electroacoustic music, often incorporating intermedia or theatrical elements and reflecting his interest in systems and musical processes drawn from such sources as fractal geometry and chaos theory. Klein's compositions have been performed and broadcast throughout the Americas, Europe, and Asia, and have been featured at national and international music venues. He's been a featured guest composer at many institutions worldwide and has won more awards than I can list here, has released many recordings on the Innova, Centaur, Crystal, and Mark labels. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So I'd love to ask you some general questions about your compositions, but I want to start with these new pieces that you collaborated on with our students. When you begin something this way, and this isn't the first time you've collaborated with writers.
Right, that's correct.
When you begin this way in tandem with writers, how do you start? I was kind of surprised that, to learn that you wanted recordings of the students' readings first rather than just reading the printed poems.
Right. This project is related to the one that Alice Fulton and I did together about 6 years ago, which was a setting of 3 of her poems from her book Felt that were also for computer music setting. I've done a number of other settings of, in fact, it occurred to me just recently that the last 15 years, almost everything I've done compositionally has had some kind of literary background, whether it's a literal setting of a text or if it's just literature that somehow influenced the piece I'm working on. And but most of them have some kind of text base to them, either with spoken text or with sung text or whatnot. In the case of these settings, it's the reason for needing the poets' actual reading, having them read their poems, is that a lot of the work that I do with computer music deals with manipulation of the vocal sounds, the spoken sounds, and text-based sounds. So even though I knew I was going to be using a lot of non-vocal sounds in the setting, I wanted to start with that as the basis. And also the idea of just getting the personality of the poet. You know, you can get so much out of the poet's personality from the writing, or even looking at the poem on the page and kind of seeing the layout, how that is something that informs the poet or the poem itself. But also just the timbre of the voice and the pacing and just kind of the personality of the poet, I think, comes out that way. So that actually helped as well, to be able to hear the 4 poets that I set, having them read the poems.
So can you give a specific example of say something about the particular delivery or the sound of the voice of one of these poets, how specifically they inform, say, a certain part of one of the songs?
Well, part of it is that if I'm going to be using particular text cues in there, like there may be some specific words that are significant in the poem, and I like to have the actual, if the poet's going to be reading the poem with the music, I'd like to have that same voice, which makes it a little bit difficult if the poem is read by another poet or another reader, I guess. In fact, Alice Fulton's pieces have been done by numerous readers other than Alice, and so it's kind of an odd counterpoint that comes out when you hear her voice on the computer music, and yet it's a different voice reading. I mean, it makes a different experience in a way. But specifically for the poets that I set this time, the second year MFA students, just in some cases I would say maybe in the case of Ben Garcia, he had a kind of languid delivery in his presentation of his poem, and I kind of took that and used that as a kind of basis for how the music itself would have a kind of pacing, I guess, to it.
What is broken? It rains and rains. The wind rocks a branch. The branch taps the chain link fence, chiming at each flick. Thing, thing, thing. Discarded, as of no worth, like a human touched hatchling, brushed from the limb on which it was born. Maybe you've taken one in before, kept it on peanut butter and millet. Shut up in a box for its own sake, and to keep it from taking a shit on all the things you love to love. You're happy to see it go, proud even. All the while, thinking you had fixed something you had done, but had not.
And there was maybe a little bit more sense of urgency in, say, Clayton's. I don't even know if I want to say urgency, but there was a little bit more kind of forward thrust, I guess, in the way he spoke in his text. And so I picked that up, maybe the way that the sounds would be reinforcing that.
It opens with the car horns.
Yeah, actually, it's a kind of an ignition trying to start.
Oh, right, that's right.
I went through a number of different car sounds. Obviously, that poem is based on it's automobile, and there's references to dogs in there, and vultures used metaphorically. So there are a lot of symbols and images that were really rich with a lot of sonic possibilities in there. So I went through a lot of car sounds and threw away a lot of things I didn't want to use. Yeah. Ultimately, I ended up with the ignition starting it there. So.
Elegy for a car. Vultures with bare bellies pick and prod at a heap with gas-tinged beaks. The beast on cinder blocks sits in the sun that's thick, like the sound of kicking a big dog in the ribs. The drum boom muted by fur. A father and son stroll through the mud to the dripping carcass, menaced by mustaches that with a drop of gasoline could clean apart for a jewelry display case. Time rears its fangs more openly here. I can see the upper gums, my God.
So, well, I'm noticing that a lot of these pieces, you're certainly working with samples here, but I'm also hearing, I think, some sort of metallic-sounding synth pads and other instruments. I wonder if you could talk about what instruments you use, both acoustic and electronic, and whether you're simply recording them straight, or are you using the recording medium also as a kind of instrument?
Right, that's a good question with regard to computer music. That's always the issue that comes about. Let me answer that question by going back to the last question, because it kind of connects into it. Sani's poem was one that I immediately was attracted to because of the very rich use of language and the very colorful, and it wasn't a narrative poem, but it had a real strong kind of color quality to it, I guess you could say, and a lot of really interesting images, and not so many images that were referential to specific sounds, like in Clayton's with the car sounds and all that. But so what I decided to do with hers is use exclusively her spoken voice as the sound source. So every sound in the setting of the Tacey Atsitty poem is completely her speaking. Yeah. So there's no other sounds in there at all. And that was really a challenge, because what I was trying to do was come up with some kinds of sounds that somehow simulate maybe some of the imagery she was creating, but all based on the sound of the voice coming out. So it required a lot of synthesis, a lot of computer processing of specifically the voice.
Gorge Dweller, Evensong, 1. At the throat of this tree you see me kneel, steep into leaves and pockets of shale. My voice hollows out veins and roots. I look to you to see you, fallen mouth from the sky, up where lips round off over descant, steep into leaves and pockets of shale. Open, rain-beaded blossom, uvular angles, where rocks fall out of themselves, utter, up where lips round off over descant. I want to go back to Ruth, mouth ever so filled, to the lips before the fall, words spill, where rocks fall out of themselves, utter a prayer, both limb and leaf bent skyward, and the calm before collapse, creek cut, at the lips before the fall, a word spill. From leaf tongue, Father, from the cracks in the calm before collapse, creek cut, in the throat of this tree, you see me kneel. My voice hollows out veins in roots.
Now, in a poem like the one by Beth's poem, that's what I was trying to think of. Actually, that was the one that used a lot of that's a poem that has a lot of reference to China, because she spent some time in China, so there's a lot of imagery that came out of that. And in the way, the layout of Beth's poem, it uses the page very effectively, because the poem is fragmented and kind of spread out across the page. So you really have to see it to get the full effect of the poem. Right. But what I wanted to do with that was, because there's this all this kind of reference to China, I wanted to use metallic Chinese instruments, mostly gong sounds, and that becomes a kind of pad in the background. So the majority of the sounds you'll hear in that setting are gong sounds, and there are only 7 different gongs that are kind of used in a pattern that repeats over and over again, with some kind of random chatter from a Chinese marketplace in the background as well, and then specific sounds that reference specific words she uses in the poem, like crickets. And there's a kind of sound that's it's actually, the sound itself is based on a gong sound, but I was able to process it to create a more of an insect kind of sound out of it. And then the sound of ice, she mentions ice a couple times in the poem. So there are a few text cues that I use to pick up, and then use those as sound sources. In that case, specifically ice was being used, but a gong was being used to simulate a cricket, but yet again, when you hear it, it'll sound more like an insect. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors that go on, I guess, in the processing itself.
In Mid-Autumn, Shanxi Province, 2007. The moon was not the moon, but it was moon. Yes, and cake, yue bing. Bing, I cried. Ice or sickness, depending. Sweet heart, you are still where you are. The kitchen, again, the cricket's vibrato in the sink. The onion turned, blushed by the window. Sick, a hush slides on bathroom tile, blue and white. Ice, alone, finds its way to bed. Yue, I said, moon, or breathing. You, come, draw the circle, reach north where I stand. Night is the syrup cupped between our hands.
Just the synth nerd in me wants to know what software you're using.
Most of this I was doing in Pityk, and then I also used a program called SoundHack, and I was doing the kind of combining the sounds and everything in Digital Performer as a kind of mock-up. What I had to do was, it's an interesting process because the computer music is cued off of the reader. So it's several sound cues that are triggered by the reader. Now I triggered those myself. I could probably have set it up to where it would trigger based on the sound of a word that they spoke, but I'm just following the reader. So in the case of Alice's settings I did 6 years ago, I didn't do it like this. It was just a single track, a fixed media, what we used to call tape music, where it just you play it, start, and then it ends after it ends. And she had to use a watch to follow along, hit the timings. It just makes it much more difficult and unnatural for a poet to have to read her poem and look at the watch all the time to make sure she's along with the music.
Yeah.
I didn't want that to be the case with this new setting. And in fact, I changed Alice's setting so it now is triggered like this. At least some of the cues are triggered, so she won't have to hit as many of the cues as she used to. But in the case of this piece, I knew I was going to be using as many as 18 cues, I think, in Sani's poem, and as few as, I think, 5. I think Ben's has 5 cues in it that will follow the poet. But I had to create a kind of framework in Digital Performer where I laid out their audio track, their reading of the text, and then I built the sounds around it.
Oh, cool.
And then kind of peeled them off and made separate soundtracks out of it.
So this leads me to another question, and I guess I'll find the answer out tomorrow night. But how do you make computer music compelling on stage in a live performance, not just in what will be seen tomorrow, but in your other performances of your other compositions?
I happen to be a person that really likes performers, really likes to see somebody on stage doing something when I'm watching it. And a lot of computer music, and going back in the early days of tape music and early electroacoustic music, where it was just somebody in the back of the room and they pushed the play button and it would play, and then the room gets dark and everybody sits there and looks at this empty stage, and then at the end they all applaud. I mean, it's ostensibly for the composer, but you're typically used to applauding for human beings on the stage.
Of course.
And that there's a long tradition of people writing these pieces we now call fixed media pieces or tape pieces, where there's nobody on stage. But I'm not terrible. I find that not having a person on stage in some kind of performance capacity is a missing piece for me. And it's one of the reasons you mentioned I am interested in theatrical aspects of my music, not just sitting up there and playing an instrument, but what can you do physically on stage that engages the audience. And some instruments have natural physicality to them. You watch a percussionist play, and it's very physical. They have to move around stage, or a trombonist or a violinist or something like that. Maybe a clarinetist is not so interesting to watch because their instrument stays fixed. They don't move around. And so I like to be able to do things to kind of enhance that experience, maybe emphasize some of the natural theatricality of a performance experience like that. So in the case of computer music, I have actually never composed a piece that doesn't have some live component to it, either a performer, like an instrumentalist or a singer or a speaker or a dancer or something like that. That's always as part of the piece. And it's just a personal thing. I have arguments with some of my colleagues about this, or not so much arguments, discussions, because there's kind of an aesthetic thing. Yeah. Some people like the purity of just a pure electroacoustic piece with no performers and dark in the house lights and all that. I happen to like to see the live component of the performer.
A friend of mine are in a sort of electronica duo together, and a lot of our stuff is triggered from electronic instruments, and we had to figure out ways to do gigs with it. That's,
Right.
One of us used a ribbon controller as kind of like a cello,
Right.
and the other has figured out how to use a theremin to trigger, to send out MIDI signals and so on.
And you probably noticed that people like that fact of watching you. There's a kind of one-to-one correlation between something you're doing on stage and the sound that's coming out.
Well, I think people like the notion of a performance as a thing that cannot be reproduced.
Right.
That there is something happening that is somewhat spontaneous.
Right. And there's a little risk involved too. Something might crash, or a string might break on a cello, or something like that.
We're all just like wanting a fight to break out at a hockey game. We're hoping for disaster.
Right.
Since most of our listeners are probably more attuned to the literary world than the world of contemporary composition, I wonder if you could talk about your origins as a composer and which composers and compositional styles have influenced you.
Well, like probably all composers, I started as a performer. I was a bassoonist, and I played saxophone and percussion later on. So I did a lot of performing and started composing in high school, but it wasn't really until college that I really started to understand it's like a lot of kids, I guess, they go to college and they start to discover things that are happening they had no awareness of. And some early composers I really liked a lot were Stravinsky, and in college I started getting really interested in George Ligeti, a Hungarian composer whose son, actually Lucas, is a very well-known jazz musician and composer in his own right. As I started to find my own voice as a composer, you start to kind of find the things of yours that you do that are connected with the past and things that are different, and try to find your own path like that. As far as composers' works, things I'm interested in, I'm really interested in process a lot. Pieces where you can hear a kind of systematic process. I don't really mean academically oriented music necessarily, like 12-tone music or things like that, but what I like about Ligeti's music so much is that he kind of sets up a system and then he breaks it down. So it's almost like a machine falling apart. I really enjoy that aspect of hearing something taking place, kind of a process of direction where something is going, whether it's a convergence, a kind of coalescence of material, or a kind of dissipation of material, kind of expansions and contractions. I like these kind of, it's one of the reasons I like to use scientific metaphors as well, these kind of scientific processes, numerical processes from math. That's one of the reasons I found Alice's writing so interesting.
That's
and
right,
she
of course.
makes a lot of those references in her own work, and as well as references to music. And she's one of the few poets, when you read a musical reference, it sounds like a musician talking. She really knows what she's talking about from the kind of the inside.
I think science, music, and literature are connected in weird ways at Cornell.
Yeah,
we're that kind of institution.
Yeah, it's good to have that. I think it's really exciting and invigorating for an artist of any kind to be kind of have a chance to work with the artists in other areas. And I would include scientists in there as well, particularly the ones that are really creative and interested in things other than just being in a lab working, on a particular project, but the kind of elegance of science. I guess that's what I really like about using those in my work.
I noticed that, and this will be my last question, that among your interests is the music of Frank Zappa.
Oh, yeah.
And
I should have mentioned him earlier.
Yeah, I immediately thought, okay, there's someone who is sort of strove to blur the lines between high and low culture and tried to bring theatricality to meticulously composed music. So what kind of influence has he had on you?
Well, he's a composer. I find out more and more about him every year, every week, and
there's an infinite amount of things to find out about.
He wrote a lot of music, and not all of it was great, but in fact, part of even the bad stuff is it works in his output, what he called the project object. I mean, it kind of makes sense because he'll have something really banal right next to something incredibly profound, and it makes this really interesting kind of intersection between the two. I've been teaching a class on his music at UNT for about the last 10 years now, I guess, and it's an endless supply of students that want to take that class because he's a pretty fascinating figure. And you're right, this idea of kind of high and low art, and he kind of thrusts them together in strange ways. He also, on one extreme, incredibly, as you mentioned, meticulous and very precise kind of notation that's really incredibly difficult for a performer to do, and yet some really wild improvisation and some completely random kind of John Cage elements in there. And
I think he's one of the first rock musicians also to embrace new technology.
Oh yeah, and he was on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that was one of the things. My interest in Zappa came from his orchestral music, actually. Although I knew about him when I was younger, but I really was a bit of a nerd as far as my musical taste. When I was growing up, I really liked classical music, being an orchestral player and all. And so that was kind of my first into his music. And in fact, most people find his classical music after they've learned about his rock and roll or jazz or whatnot. And I came kind of the other way. And part of like you say, his huge contribution was that he was always looking for the state-of-the-art technology for his music. And he was ahead of the curve on composers' rights and self-production and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, he really is a fascinating person just all around politically and from a business model and from, aesthetically and as a performer. I mean, just there's always stuff to look at there.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to hearing this tomorrow.
Sure. Well, I thank you for the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
Great. I'm afraid we're out of time, but please check back next week when I will be interviewing fiction writer and editor Laura Furman. Writers at Cornell is now available at the iTunes Store. It's free. Just type Writers at Cornell into the search bar. For more information about the Cornell University English and Creative Writing programs, please visit our website at www.arts.cornell.edu/English. Our theme song is by Andrew Chalfin. You can hear more of his music at thetrolleybox.com. I'm J. Robert Lennon, and thanks for listening.